April 1967, a quiet room, a heavy table, and a briefcase placed dead center like an accusation waiting to be opened. Inside that briefcase sat $10 million in cash, not numbers on paper, not a promise, real money, stacked high enough to change the shape of a man's soul. $10 million in 1967 meant escape, power, immunity. It meant never answering to anyone ever again. It meant erasing your past and rewriting your future with ink made of fear and obedience. It was enough to buy buildings, politicians, judges, silence, enough to disappear and live like a king in a country where no one knew your name. And yet the question hanging in the air wasn't how much the money was worth, it was what it would cost. Because money like that never comes without blood on it, never comes without strings, never comes without demanding a piece of who you are. Most men don't hesitate when they see it. Most men reach for it before the lid is fully opened. That's why the offer worked 11 times before 11 trusted men, 11 loyal soldiers. 11 men who saw the cash and forgot everything else they ever swore to stand for. But this time the briefcase was placed in front of Frank Lucas, a quiet man, a driver, an errand runner, someone nobody thought to fear. And Frank didn't grab it, didn't run, didn't sell anyone out, because Frank Lucas didn't know the most important part yet. He didn't know the money was never the point. He didn't know the offer was a lie. He didn't know this wasn't a deal at all. It was a test. And Frank Lucas didn't know this was a test. Yet, 11:47 p.m., Bumpy Johnson's office was quiet in the way graveyards are quiet. No movement, no sound, just pressure. Thick mahogany walls soaked with decades of secrets. Power lived here, and men had died here. Bumpy Johnson sat behind his desk like a judge who already knew the verdict. Fingers pressed together, eyes steady, calm in a way that made violence feel inevitable rather than threatening. Because when Bumpy shouted, there was still a chance. When he went quiet, someone didn't leave the room alive. Behind Frank Lucas stood Zach Walker, 6'4", 260 pounds of muscle and murder, Bumpy's enforcer for 15 years, a man who had stopped counting bodies because numbers no longer mattered. Zach's gun was pressed against the back of Frank's skull. Cold metal, gun oil, anticipation instead of fear in the man holding it. Zach wanted permission. Just one word, one nod, one breath from Bumpy, and Frank's life would end against those walls. Frank didn't turn around, didn't beg, didn't flinch. In this world, fear was weakness, and weakness was a death sentence. Bumpy leaned forward slightly, voice soft, almost kind. Tell me again. That was the danger. That softness. Tell me what Doc offered you. Frank's mouth was dry. His heart pounded so hard it felt loud enough to give him away. He could feel the gun pressed tighter as he spoke, because every word was a step closer to survival or execution. $10 million cash. Doc wanted everything in return. Supply routes, cops, judges, businesses, protection. 40 years of an empire mapped out and handed over, and when Bumpy died, Harlem would go back to the Italians. Gift wrapped. No resistance, no memory of who had held it before. The room didn't react. No shouting, no anger, just silence. Bumpy looked at Frank like he was reading the last page of a man's life. And then he asked the only question that mattered. And what did you tell him? Frank knew the next words would decide whether he walked out or was carried out. And the gun pressed closer, waiting. The warehouse sat in Hunts Point like a secret the city pretended not to see. Cold, concrete, high ceilings, empty except for a single table placed under harsh white lights. And on that table was more money than Frank Lucas had ever seen in one place. Stacks of $100 bills arranged with military precision, edges sharp, bands tight, the smell of fresh ink and paper hanging heavy in the air. Money so clean it almost looked unreal. $10 million in cash. Not promised, not wired, not hidden in accounts, right there, waiting. Doc let Frank touch it, feel the weight, let the bills slide through his fingers slow enough for imagination to take over. Because that's how temptation works. You don't rush it. You let a man see who he could become, what his life could look like if he stopped being loyal and started being smart. Then Doc explained the price. Not just information, everything. Names, routes, judges, cops, businesses, protection. The entire skeleton of Bumpy Johnson's empire laid bare. And when Bumpy died, Harlem would be handed back to the Italians. Clean, quiet, like the last 40 years of black control never happened, like the streets never belonged to anyone else, like Bumpy Johnson never existed. It wasn't just a payoff, it was an erasure, a return to the old order where power had a color and permission. $10 million to help rewrite history in someone else's favor. $10 million to become rich by making sure black hands never touched the crown again. The money sat there silently, patient, confident, because money like that assumes it will be chosen. It always had been, 11 times already, and for 3 days. Frank Lucas walked away carrying the weight of that table in his mind, seeing the stacks every time he closed his eyes. And the question followed him everywhere, not whether he could take it, but whether he wanted to live as the man who did. Frank told Bumpy he waited 3 days because he needed to be sure, not sure about the money, but sure about himself, because $10 million doesn't just offer comfort, it offers escape, and Frank had spent his entire life wanting out. He grew up in rural North Carolina with dirt under his fingernails and hunger in his stomach, watching his mother bend her back in tobacco fields for pennies, watching his father drink himself into the ground because being powerless every day slowly kills a man, watching brothers and sisters grow up with no future waiting for them, no shortcuts, no mercy, just survival. $10 million could have erased all of that. It could have bought rest for his mother, dignity for his family, safety he never had. And for 3 days, that money followed him everywhere. When he closed his eyes, he saw the stacks, felt their weight, imagined a life where nobody could touch him, where loyalty was optional and fear worked for him instead of against him. But then another thought crept in, quieter, heavier. Who would he be if he took it? Not what would he have, but what would he become? A man who sold out the only person who ever trusted him. A man who traded legacy for comfort. A man who survived by betraying everything that made survival worth something. Frank realized that if he took the money, he might live longer, richer, safer, but he would die knowing exactly what kind of man he was. And that truth scared him more than any gun ever could. So after 3 days of temptation, 3 days of imagining both futures, Frank Lucas walked into Bumpy Johnson's office ready to live with the consequences, whatever they were. Frank lifted his eyes and spoke slowly, carefully, because these were the words that would either end him or define him forever. He said the money would run out, that power always fades, that buildings crumble and empires fall no matter how high they rise. But a man has to live with who he is long after the cash is spent. He said taking that money would make him someone he couldn't recognize, someone his mother would be ashamed of, someone who could never look in the mirror without seeing betrayal staring back. He said maybe he could live rich if he took it. Maybe he could die old in some mansion surrounded by things he didn't earn. But he would die knowing that when the choice came, when loyalty and money stood on opposite sides of the room, he chose money. And that was a kind of death he wasn't willing to accept. Not for 10 million, not for 100 million, not for anything. The room changed when he said it. The air shifted. The gun at the back of his head stopped pressing forward. Even Zach Walker hesitated, his finger loosening on the trigger, like something inside him had stalled. Silence filled the office again. But it wasn't the kind that came before violence. It was the kind that comes before revelation. Bumpy Johnson stared at Frank for a long moment, reading him, measuring him, and then, unexpectedly, he laughed. Not sharp, not cruel, but real, deep, genuine. The kind of laugh that comes when a man finally sees what he's been searching for. The tension cracked like glass, and Frank realized something was very wrong. Because men like Bumpy Johnson don't laugh when they're about to kill you. They laugh when something has gone exactly according to plan. Bumpy leaned back in his chair, still smiling, and then he said it slow, deliberate. There was no doc. The words didn't land at first. They floated, meaningless, until he continued. The warehouse was mine. The money was mine. The men who picked you up worked for me. The Italian takeover, the threats, the promises, every last detail was manufactured. A stage built to see what you would do when no one was watching, when you thought betrayal had no consequences, when $10 million sat in front of you and all you had to do was reach for it. Frank Lucas felt the room tilt every sleepless night, every moment of temptation, every doubt. All of it had been orchestrated. Bumpy's smile faded into something heavier as he went on. I ran this test on 11 men, trusted men, killers, lieutenants, soldiers who swore they'd die for me, men who had been with me for decades, and every single one of them took the deal. Some didn't even wait a day. Some negotiated for more money. All of them were ready to sell 40 years of work the moment they thought I was weak, the moment they smelled the end. Bumpy stood and walked slowly toward the window, pain tugging at his steps. I'm dying, he said quietly. The cancer was already winning. The doctors gave him months, maybe less. And with time running out, there was only one question left worth answering. Who could be trusted with what he built? Who wouldn't sell Harlem the moment he was in the ground? He turned back to Bumpy Johnson and looked at Frank with something close to relief. Now I know. And the real mystery finally revealed itself. Why did Frank pass? When every other man failed. Bumpy spoke slower now, not like a boss, but like a man explaining the truth at the end of his life. He said the others failed because they'd been around too long, because comfort rots loyalty, because entitlement makes men believe they deserve what they didn't earn. Those men thought years of service meant ownership, thought survival meant superiority, and when the money appeared, they didn't see betrayal, they saw opportunity. Bumpy said hunger was different. Hunger remembers what it's like to have nothing. Hunger doesn't assume, it earns, it waits, it learns. That's why Frank didn't fold. Not because he was better, but because he was still hungry, still grounded, still aware that everything he had could disappear tomorrow. Bumpy said real loyalty isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand rewards. It shows up when the man you serve is weak, dying, exposed, when there's finally a reason to leave, and you stay anyway. He said, loyalty like that can't be taught, can't be bought, can't be threatened into existence. You either have it or you don't. Then Bumpy looked at Frank Lucas and nodded once. Small, deliberate, like a king sealing a decision without ceremony. No speeches, no witnesses, just acknowledgement. And in that quiet moment, Frank understood what had just happened, because Bumpy Johnson didn't say the word heir, didn't make an announcement, didn't hand over a crown. But the room knew, the air knew, power had shifted without noise, and whatever Bumpy had built, whatever secrets he carried, whatever empire stood behind those walls, it was about to belong to Frank Lucas. And Frank still didn't know how much he was about to inherit. Bumpy opened a drawer and pulled out a thick folder, heavy, worn, the kind of folder that didn't hold paper so much as power. Inside were names, routes, bank accounts, Politicians, judges, cops, businesses that looked clean and weren't. 40 years of survival mapped out line by line. Bumpy slid it across the desk and told Frank this was no longer information. It was responsibility. Then he reached for a smaller piece of paper, just an address and a name. Ike Atkinson, a soldier stationed in Southeast Asia, quietly moving heroin through military channels, cargo no one searched, coffins no one opened, flags no one questioned. Bumpy explained the real game. The Italians owned the streets because they owned the French connection, heroin from Marseille. Stepped on so many times it barely worked by the time it hit Harlem. 5% purity, maybe 6 on a good day. Addicts paying top dollar for garbage. But the product coming out of the Golden Triangle was different. Raw, untouched, nearly pure, strong enough to be cut again and again without losing its edge. Cheaper to source, impossible to compete with once it arrived. Bumpy said if Frank could control that pipeline, bypass the Italians completely, he wouldn't just enter the market, he would own it, quietly, patiently, without announcing himself. Frank's mind was already moving. Supply chains, distribution, pricing, silence before scale. Bumpy warned him not to rush, not to celebrate, because the moment the old powers realized what was happening, they would come hard. Not just Italians, not just rivals, but men who believed Harlem was never supposed to belong to someone like Frank. The blueprint sat between them now, not yet named, not yet legendary, but already forming into something unstoppable. And somewhere in the city, someone was already going to try to stop it. Bumpy's voice dropped when he said the name everyone in Harlem already assumed would inherit the crown. Nicky Barnes, flashy, ambitious, loud where power usually stayed quiet, the kind of man who wore success instead of carrying it. Everyone thought Nicky was next, everyone except Bumpy, because entitlement had already poisoned him. Bumpy said Nicky believed the empire was owed to him, believed years of proximity meant ownership, believed grooming was the same as trust, and that was only the surface. Then Bumpy revealed the part that could get a man killed just for hearing it. Nicky wasn't just ambitious, he was compromised. The FBI had him. 3 years already. Meetings in parked cars. Quiet payments. Small pieces of information at first, just enough to prove cooperation, just enough to keep him clean while everyone else burned. That's why Nicky never got arrested, why he moved like he was untouchable, because as long as he was useful, he was protected. Bumpy reached into his pocket and placed a small brass key on the desk, old, heavy, unremarkable to anyone who didn't know what it unlocked. Safe deposit box, Harlem Savings Bank. Inside were photographs, transcripts, payment records, proof Nicky was a rat, proof that would destroy him from every direction at once. Italians, his own people, the streets, the law, all of it. Bumpy told Frank this wasn't a weapon to use immediately. It was insurance, the kind you only cash in when someone tries to kill you first. Frank closed his hand around the key and felt the weight of it settle. Power that didn't shout, power that waited, because now he knew something no one else did. The presumed heir was already dead. He just didn't know it yet. And the only question left was timing. When would Frank Lucas turn the key? The call came without warning. No buildup, no final speech. Bumpy Johnson collapsed in a restaurant on 132nd Street with fried chicken still on the table. The cancer had weakened his heart just enough, and that was it. Decades of power, fear, protection, gone in a moment. Harlem felt it instantly, like a vacuum opening in the streets, because when a king dies, everyone starts moving. 3 days later, the city gathered at Abyssinian Baptist Church. 2,000 people packed inside, politicians who owed their careers to quiet donations, gangsters who owed their lives to protection, preachers who knew where the money really came from, everyone waiting to see who would step forward. Frank Lucas arrived late on purpose, walking down the center aisle carrying a briefcase, slow, deliberate, every eye following him, past mourners, past Italian observers, past Nicky Barnes, sitting near the front with the confidence of a man who thought the crown was already his. Frank stopped at the open casket, looked down at Bumpy Johnson one last time, then opened the briefcase. Stacks of cash came out one by one, 10,000, 20, 50, $100,000. Every dollar Frank had saved in 5 years of loyalty, placed beside the man who tested him. The church froze. No whispers, no movement. Then Frank turned to the room and spoke without raising his voice. He said Harlem would not be divided, not sold, not handed back to anyone, that Bumpy didn't leave an empire to be picked apart. He left it to him, and anyone who disagreed could come see him directly. Frank closed the briefcase, walked out without looking back, and in that silence, everyone understood what had just happened. No announcement, no vote, no blood, a coronation without ceremony. The throne had been claimed, and somewhere outside those church doors, the war was already beginning. Nicky Barnes moved first, because men who believe power is owed to them never wait. He sat down with the Italian families in Little Italy and promised them what they'd been waiting years to take back. Harlem, their product, their rules. A return to the old arrangement where black hands distributed and white hands decided. Nicky sold himself as the solution, called Frank a nobody, a driver, a mistake, and the Italians listened, because they always listened to men who sounded confident, while Nicky was shaking hands in back rooms. Frank Lucas was on a plane to Southeast Asia, quiet, invisible, finalizing the pipeline Bumpy had drawn for him. Coffins draped in flags, military cargo no one dared to inspect, routes no police unit could touch. The first shipment came back clean, pure, stronger than anything Harlem had ever seen. Frank didn't flood the streets. He tested, adjusted, then released it. Dealers noticed immediately. Addicts felt it instantly. Word spread faster than violence ever could. The product hit harder, lasted longer, cost less. And suddenly, corners went quiet. Italian supply dried up, their customers disappeared overnight. Harlem shifted without a war being declared, because markets don't need gunshots to change sides. They follow value. Within months, Frank controlled most of the city's heroin trade, not by fear, but by math, purity, price, reliability. Nicky watched his promises collapse in real time. The Italians blamed him. His own people lost faith. The crown he thought was waiting for him dissolved into smoke. And Frank Lucas sat at the center of it all without making speeches, without celebrating, without announcing himself, because real power doesn't perform, it expands, but success has a gravity of its own. It pulls eyes, suspicion, enemies, and somewhere outside Harlem, someone was already starting to ask the wrong question. Who is Frank Lucas, and how did he move this fast? The fall didn't begin with a gun or a raid, it began with a spotlight. March 1971, Madison Square Garden, the Allie Frazier fight, the night the whole world was watching. And sitting ringside in a chinchilla coat worth more than most houses was Frank Lucas. Louder than he'd ever been, richer than he'd ever needed to prove. A detective named Richie Roberts noticed him that night. Not because Frank was dangerous, but because he didn't fit. Better seats than the Italian bosses, better seats than executives, better seats than men who were supposed to own the city. And that single question started the unraveling. Who is that guy? And how does he have that kind of power? Years of surveillance followed, wiretaps, money trails, informants, until the door came down. Frank was arrested, the empire exposed, and when the choice came again, Frank remembered the first test, loyalty over money. He cooperated, not to save himself alone, but to finish what Bumpy started. He handed over names, roots, corrupt cops, politicians, and finally, he used the key, the proof that Nicky Barnes was an informant. The streets learned first, then the Italians, then everyone. Nicky vanished into witness protection, stripped of reputation, stripped of fear, stripped of legacy, a man who chose betrayal and lived, but was never remembered. Frank served time, lost the empire, but kept the one thing money never bought him, his name, his story, his moment, because loyalty created the empire, but visibility destroyed it. And in the end, the $10 million Frank turned down became worth more than anything he ever made. Because sometimes walking away from the money doesn't make you poor. Sometimes it makes you immortal.